And this is, as Catherine said, an Entity Framework Tips and Tricks session. My name is Julie Lerman, and as Catherine also said, and hopefully you already know, I've written a book for O'Reilly Media called Programming Entity Framework. That came out in February, and it was very nice to have my life back for a short while, but now I've started working on the next edition of the book for Entity Framework 4. So I'll be doing that for a while, and I believe we're going to start pushing the rough cuts out sometime later in the fall. So this is some of my contact information, and you'll get access to this along with the slides at a later time. So what I'm going to do today is cover some tips and tricks. This does presume that you do know something about Entity Framework, and if you've never used Entity Framework before, it's still not a bad thing to look at this, a little more advanced stuff, and then you'll have it in the back of your head when you start working with Entity Framework. So you'll be way ahead of the game. One of the things that I'll be doing is I'll talk a little bit about some of the pain points we do have in the current version with Visual Studio 2008, which is normally a part of this presentation, but a lot of these things have been fixed in Entity Framework 4. So I'm not going to spend too much time on them, but we will talk about them. Then I'm going to just delve into a bunch of other topics, and rather than list them for you because of the short time, I'm going to go ahead and just jump right in. So one of the first things people notice when they start working with an entity data model in Entity Framework is that you won't see foreign keys in the model. If you look at this little model that's of two entities, a customer and an order entity, what's not
Julie, I'm
yes.
sorry to interrupt. People are asking if you could speak up. They're saying you're coming through very low.
Oh, no. I'll try. How's this? Does it sound a little better?
Is that better?
Not, then I'm going to have to go to the handset.
No one's replying, so let's give it a try like this.
Okay, and I will also try to talk louder, pretend there's 1,000 people in the room.
Good.
All right, so the entity data model in version 1 doesn't display the foreign key. So you don't have, not only do you not see it in the entity data model, but when you're interacting with the entities in code, you don't have direct access to that foreign key. That's been a big problem for people. So in Entity Framework 4, the foreign key will show up as a scalar property in the entity data model. Now that's going to be the default when you build a model, but you can also go back to this now classic version of the entity data model. The reason that the foreign key isn't there is because we do have the ability to navigate between the entities. This is all based on entity relationship modeling. So we can use the relationship, which here is defined by the line between the two entities. We can use that relationship to get between the back and forth from one entity to another or to collections, and shouldn't normally need to use that to leverage that foreign key. But people have a need for them. Sometimes they just want to set a foreign key without having to have an object available. When you're working with ASP.NET data binding, that's very dependent on foreign keys. There's a lot of places you literally need the foreign key. So what I want to show you, even though you'll have it in Entity Framework 4, I'll just show you very quickly where you can find that in Entity Framework version 1. I'm going to flip over to a really cool tool called LINQPad, which was written actually by another O'Reilly author, Joe Albahari, and he's got a LINQ book and a C# book out. And this is a great tool, and it does support Entity Framework now. So what I wanted to show you about the foreign keys, if we queried for orders, and orders would have in the database have a foreign key for the customer ID. You can see when you look at the store query, there's the results. I'm going to flip over to the store query. It does bring back those foreign keys. So they are queried from the database and brought back to Entity Framework. The problem is, again, we don't see them directly in the entity. But they are available if you drill further down into the entity. In this case, with this order, we didn't query for the customers. We only have the order. But the customer ID was brought back, and it was stuck not into the customer, but into the customer reference. So if you look here, you see if I open up the entity key for the customer reference and then keep drilling in, I can find that ID, which happens to be 1, the person ID, inside of the value property inside of the entity key value. So if you're looking for that information, you can navigate in, you can drill into the entity, and you can get that foreign key. You can also set the foreign key if you want. You can set the foreign key if you know how to construct an entity key. And I'll just scroll down. I'll scroll down here. So this is if I was going to drill through all of this stuff. And again, because it's Entity Framework 4, it's not going to be such a big issue. But an entity key you can construct. If I have my order, new order, dot customer reference, then I could set the entity key, and I could create a new entity key on the fly. Entity key. I need a system.data.entity key. And then what I need to do is pass in the strongly typed name of the entity set. And in this case, it's customers. And the name is a string of the property. And in this model, customer uses person ID for its identifying key. And then the value. So you can construct these things. You can set these on the fly. And this is a much better way of being able to set a key, a foreign key for an entity without having to go back out to the database and bring the entity back so that you can do the more typical way in Entity Framework, which would be to say order.customer equals and then set the object to it. So you can access the foreign keys or actually set the foreign keys directly in the Entity Framework code, even though we don't have access to that. And again, it's in the new version of the Entity Framework, which we won't see yet because they didn't get it into the Beta 1, but we'll see it in the Beta 2. The foreign key values will be right there so you can set them directly, and a lot of these problems will go away. But there may be people who are it's going to be a while before they get to using the new version. So as you get the slide deck, you'll see, again, the way to create the entity key on the fly. And it's also possible to have entity keys that are composed of multiple properties. So there's also an example here for you of how to do that if you have multiple properties. Another big problem with Entity Framework version 1 has been when you've been looking at if you've looked at the store queries that are generated from the queries that you create, maybe a link to entities or an Entity Framework query. One of the things people do a lot when they're constructing LINQ queries is take advantage of .NET methods. For example, in this query, I'm using the starts with function that's a string method. And Entity Framework wasn't doing a very good job. Entity Framework plus the SQL client provider were not doing a very good job of composing a store query out of that query. And if you look at this query that it creates, you can see that this is certainly not the way I might write that query in T-SQL. You'd probably be better off writing something with the operator like. Now, I looked at these queries and I thought they were fine, but I'm also the kind of person who would write select star and think that that's an acceptable query. But I talked to a number of DBAs and they pointed some of these things out for me. This is actually a really bad query for performance in SQL Server because it won't take advantage of SQL Server searching, and it's going to look through every single record in that table the way this is constructed. So these actually are things that have been fixed. Not every single thing that people have been finding has been fixed, but there's been a huge amount of headway with Entity Framework 4. But in the meantime, you can control these kinds of things, and this one, for example. But the solution would be to go to Entity SQL, and LINQ actually compiles Entity SQL also, which is really great. So Entity SQL has a like operator. So rather than depending on whatever the compiler is going to do with my query and create, I can have a little more control over how the query is going to come out if I'm writing an Entity SQL. And you can see if I have used the like operator in this query here, I'm getting a like operator in the actual raw SQL. So that's really helpful. There's a blog post on the ADO.NET team blog, which is, I'll just type it here. The compiler will hate it. blogs.msdn.com/ADONet. It's a recent blog post, and it talks about a lot of the improvements that have been made with the query processing. And the query processing takes place in two spots. Entity Framework is responsible for part of it, and the specific query provider also has a lot to do with how the query comes out. But there's been a lot of improvements made. You won't see them yet in Beta 1, but we should be seeing them in Beta 2. But in the meantime, this is what I've been doing when I need to have a little more control over some of those queries. And I think one of the other tips that this points to is the importance of not just presuming what's happening when you're writing those queries. I actually have written a little log application that will log my LINQ to entities and entity SQL queries along with the store queries that were generated, so I can take a look at them, or better yet, give them to a DBA who will take a look at them and be able to point out places where I might want to think about how I'm constructing my query on the entity framework side, because there are places where you can control that. So those are a couple of tips that I find really important. So another place where we've had some problems with version 1 is with around stored procedures. There's stored procedure support in the first version of the Entity Framework. It's not everything that we all might want it to be, but it's, you know, is a step in the direction of having the support that we need. One of the things that's been a real showstopper for a lot of people is that if you have stored procedures in your database that return data that is random columns, right? It does not, you're not like returning an actual record from a table, or in the case of the entity data model, whatever is coming out of that stored procedure does not line up exactly with an entity. So if you have a read store procedure that lines up with an entity, it's pretty easy to do function mapping, or to do, something called an import function, and you can map that function back to the entity. If you have a stored procedure that returns a scalar value, you also have the ability to easily use that in the entity data model. But if you have a stored procedure that returns random columns, there's really no out-of-the-box way to use those in Entity Framework. There are two ways around it. One is really not easy to do. You would need to create an entity that matches the resulting columns. But then once you create an entity, because of the rules of the metadata, the schema has some rules that you have to comply with, you would have to go into the XML and create a fake representation of the table in the database, and then you'd have to do the mapping. And that's kind of a pain to do when you have one stored procedure. But if you're working with a legacy database and you have 100 stored procedures, it's a showstopper. And I know people have just stuck with LINQ to SQL for the time being because it can automatically generate all that stuff for you. So with version 1, what I've been doing is recommending to people that rather than using the stored procedures, if you can go back into the database and create a view that matches, whose results match that stored procedure, then you can just use that view in the entity data model. I have in my model that I'm working with in LINQPad, I've got a view that's been pulled, here's an entity that's based on a view in my model, okay? And I can write queries against that entity. So if your stored procedure takes parameters, obviously you're not going to have that ability. A stored procedure in Entity Framework is like a function, and then you pass parameters in the way you would with any function. So by making it an entity and not a function, you can actually query against it. So while your view now won't have the parameters that your stored procedure did, you can do whatever you want with a view and build the queries. So, for example, well, if I started this view, and I just took a look at what that view returns. I'll just take the first 50. Okay, and then I could query against this view and say, let's just find the people whose order count, who have more than 5 orders. Let's just go back here and say where v.order count is greater than 5. Now, the nice thing about this is that that whole query is composed and sent to SQL Server. So that parameter is executed right on the SQL Server. You can't do that with stored procedures, and you can't do that with the functions that are generated from stored procedures. So you actually have a lot more flexibility by having the views, if that's an option. If you're in a shop where, you say to the DBA, well, I know you created these 150 stored procedures for me. Is it possible that you could recreate them as views? And if they say, yeah, no problem, I can do that with my hands tied behind my back, and I'd be more than happy to, then you're good to go. So that's for version 1. Version 2, things are going to get a lot easier. I'm going to open up the beta 1 of the next version. Of course, it's Entity Framework 4, not version 2. And the way that we can use those types of stored procedures now has improved a lot. In version 1, we didn't have support for complex types, but we do now. So I have a complex type in here that I've defined that matches what the results of a query that I want to use are. So here's my query here. In this case, I'm looking at the store. This is a model browser, in case you've never used that before. So I'm looking at the store, and in there I have this stored procedure. I'm going to right-click on it and create a function import, and now complex types are available as something that you can map to a stored procedure to return to. So now I'll be able to use the stored procedure, and it returns complex types. The only downside right now in the beta 1 was that I had to manually create this complex type up here. I am really hoping to see some changes along those lines in version 2 because, it's a lot easier, in the beta 2, I'm sorry. It's a lot easier than this was in Entity Framework 1, but it's still not quite where I'd like it to be. And so we'll see how that goes. So that's the tip for getting around the stored procedures right now with the current version is to go ahead and recreate those as views. So the next tip that I wanted to show you is something that I came up with while I was working with a client. I saw that he had a lot of code to return reference lists, for example, drop-down lists in his application. And because he was using LINQ to entities, which is really, the default query language when you're working with Entity Framework because it's strongly typed and it's easy to use. And it'll get you most of the way there, most of the time. So because it's strongly typed, though, he had to create different methods for each of the different types of data that he was returning. And he said, it would be so much nicer if I could just have one method that said, get me a reference list of customers, get me a reference list of account types. But that wasn't possible. It's not really possible with LINQ to entities unless you start doing some functional programming. Which is not for the faint of heart, the functional programming. So what I did was I took advantage of generics, that's been in .NET for quite a while now, generics and Entity SQL to come up with a better solution. So I'll show you the before and after. The before is that for each one of these lists that we want to return, I have a separate method to create those returns. Now, if you were building all of this logic directly in the user interface, you wouldn't have to do all of this. You could just say context.customerType. It's no big deal to call this piece of line of code. But because I've got my layers separated and my context is completely unknown to the user interface, I can't do that in the user interface. So I need methods that I can call into that will just return results. That's why I need to have these various methods. So because I'm using LINQ to entities and everything's strongly typed, there's no way really to say, well, give me a list of customer types. I have to literally write the LINQ to entities query out with the type specified in there. So what I've done instead was create the type of method that I was saying before. Wouldn't it be nice to have a method that says get reference list and just let me know which type you want me to get it, which type of list you want me to get for you, and then have one set of code, whatever type it is that you're working with. So what this set of code does is first, you could actually, I'm using the context that's already available in this particular application, but you can also pass a context in and then use it in any application that you want. But what I'm doing is I'm taking advantage not only of generics, but I'm using the metadata workspace from the Entity Framework, which is a really powerful tool. It lets you read through the metadata of your entity data model, something somewhat like doing reflection in .NET. Okay, so I'm taking advantage of the metadata workspace. I've written my own method here that will look at the entity that's in there, and it will pull out the entity set name in a strongly typed way. So it'll give me back myentities.customer or whatever the entity set is that you're using. And once I've got that string, then I can go ahead and write an entity SQL string. I can just concatenate that information in now. I just need to, once I have the type, I can get the string and get the entity set name back, and then build an entity SQL statement from that. I've also pushed in an order by parameter there. And then I can create a query and return the list. So it no longer matters at all what the type is that I'm working with. So if I go ahead and actually I'm going to stop this, I'm going to comment out the redundant code and then uncomment the code that calls my nice little method. So it doesn't change the fact that I'm still going to have to call into that method over and over again, but now I just have one method. So I'll go ahead and run that, and we can just step through one of them. So here I'm passing. Oh no, I went backwards, didn't I? Yeah, I went backwards. I already had the good one uncommented. So let's comment out the bad one, the old way of doing it, and uncomment the more efficient way, and run it again. This is what happens when you run through your demos right before you do them, just to make sure you set everything back to the right starting point, right? Okay, so now I'm going to call into my nice new method, getReferenceList. And I'm not going to walk through that just because of the time. But this method gave me back a string, which represents a strongly typed entity set name. So now I can build my entity SQL statement, which becomes select value, blah, blah, from my entities.customer type. So there's my entity SQL string. I have to let my query, my object query, know what type it's going to be using, but I have tEntity, so that's not a problem. And then it returns the list, so it didn't care what the type was at all. And that's code I can reuse over and over again in different applications. So that is a pretty powerful thing and can help you really reduce the amount of code in your application. And all of these demos I will put on the downloads page for the Learn Entity Framework website, so you can get access to them afterwards. Another pattern that I've come up with, it actually, it's not a new pattern. It's called the repository pattern, okay? But it was not something that was obvious to do in Entity Framework. When I talk about the repository pattern, what I mean is I want a way to run my code, a generic way to run my code. so that I don't have to have repeated code over and over and over again. In the same way with the last example, I was trying to reduce redundant code. But this is a different way of reducing a different type of redundant code. So when I'm executing a query, actually I'm looking at this and realizing oh yeah, I'm executing the query down here, of course. Here I'm defining a query, and then I'm executing the query. Now, every time I execute the query, I want to make sure I trap any exceptions, and I might want to do other things. For example, my logging application that I'm using to inspect the store query. I'd like to log this query every single time. What that means is whether I'm writing LINQ to Entities queries or my object queries, I'm writing this stuff over and over and over again. And I really didn't want to have to do that anymore. And I didn't think of this solution for quite a long time until I've been working with Entity Framework for a while. It just did not occur to me that this could even be possible. And what I'm doing is, actually I'll just step into it again, so run it and it'll get me right where I need to be. So here's just an example of doing it the more typical way, right? I'm defining my query, I'm logging the query, I'm executing it, and then catching all these exceptions. And then I've got another query to do. So I define it, I log it, I execute it, and then I catch all the exceptions. So what I wanted to do instead to avoid that was to have one way to execute the command. And when I finally realized that I could pass the actual query around, which now seems so obvious to me, right, but it just never occurred to me before, I can pass the query around, and then I can put it into another method that will go ahead and log the query, execute the query, and deal with any exceptions. So now I just have one place to do all that, and I don't have to rewrite all this code over and over again. So I want to show this to you a little bit, then we'll walk through it so you can see it in action. First of all, I want to show you I have a few of these queries set up. All right, here's one that I'm going to use for executing first or default, and one of them takes an object query, and then there's another load that takes an iQueryable. iQueryable is what a LINQ query returns. So I have two of these, and then I have another pair, and the other pair is for execute list. Now, one of the reasons I have execute list separately from execute first or default instead of one big generic method is because, and this may be doable, I just didn't know how, but with one of them, I'm returning an object. The other, I'm returning a list of objects. So I couldn't figure out a way, and when I'm doing this in a generic way, I couldn't figure out a way to have that flexibility to return either of those things. So I would love someday for somebody to show me how to do this more efficiently. But in the meantime, I have a pair of methods, or a method plus an overload for each of these different things. I even have one in here to do get object by key in a generic way too. If you get object by key is a method of Entity Framework. It's another way of executing a query. So let's take a look at this one. I either pass in an object query or an iQueryable, which is a LINQ query. If you look at the iQueryable, there's just a little bit of code there. But if you open up the other one, there's all of my exception handling, right? So there's a lot more code in here. So what I was doing with the two methods in the overload is rather than repeating all of the exception handlers in there, I just take the incoming LINQ query and then I can cast it, which is what I'm doing here for Visual. This is the C# way of casting. It looks a lot different. In Visual, basically, you would use C type to do the casting. But I can cast a LINQ to Entities query to an object query, and that's possible because an object query implements iQueryable, it implements iEnumerable, and it implements a few other types as well. So they're very much aligned. So I can take the incoming LINQ to Entities query, cast it to an object query, and then pass it to the other method. So then the other method has the bulk of the code in it. So let's go ahead and run through that. I actually need to switch the code around a little bit. I've started already. So I'm going to remove all of that redundant code, which is there, and actually not there. I still need to define the query. That's something that's not going to go away. So here's the second query with its redundant code. And then with this query, I'm just going to lazily use var again instead of defining what this variable is. Results equals. I'm going to use my little command executor. Execute first or default. I have to identify the type still. This is a person type. Oh, I'm missing one important thing. I have to pass in the LINQ query or it won't work very well. Okay, and then with the next one, I'll get another set of results. I'll just call those results 2 equals val.execute list this time. This is going to be a list of orders. And I'll pass in object query. And we should be good to go. So let's step through that and see what that looks like and how it works. Okay, so the first, I've already instantiated the command executor, and that's my name for it. I define the query, and then I pass it into the overload of the execute first or default method. So it found it because this is the LINQ method. So the first thing I'm doing is I'm logging it, and you'll see this code for building the log along with as part of the code that I'll put on my website with a download. So I'm not going to walk through it in too much detail, but the essential steps are that I am going to log what type it is, and I'm just using, I can do that just because I have 2 different query types here. And then I can get the string. You may not know this, but you can look at a LINQ query, and it has an expression property, an expression method, and then you can actually call toString on that and then get a string value back that tells you exactly what the LINQ query is. So that was another cool thing I figured out when I was playing with the log. Then I can use the object query toTraceString method, and again, casting the LINQ query to an object query, because toTraceString does not exist for LINQ queries, but it is a method of object query. That was actually another one of the tips that I wanted to be sure I showed you. So there's that. So people don't know that you can actually get at toTraceString when you have a LINQ query. So I'm grabbing all of these pieces of information, and then I have a little XML logger, which is not the most efficient way to do logging, but it did the trick for me to figure out how to log my queries. So that's the first thing I'm doing in my little repository method. Then I'm going to cast the LINQ query to the object query and pass it into the main method. Now the main method has a little test here to see if the incoming query has a command text or not. If this passes, that means that it's an object query with an entity SQL string. A LINQ query does not have an entity SQL string attached to it, and therefore no command text. And the reason I'm doing that test is because I already logged the query in the method that I just came out of. So I don't want to do that twice. Okay, and now finally I'm going to go ahead and execute the query. I'm going to call first or default on it. And if anything blows up, I'll go into my exception handlers. Hopefully that's not the case here. It shouldn't be. And then I'm going back to the calling method, and I can go ahead and step again. And now I've got my results. And I called first or default, so I just have a single person object there. Our buddy George Jetson. Okay? And then I do the same thing again here. And then this time I'm using list, but the point is I'm not rewriting all of this stuff over and over and over again. So we'll just go out of there. Now, another little thing I want to be sure you're aware of, we won't spend any time on this, is when you call save changes, and if you have a whole lot of entities that you've been modifying, the inserts or updates or deletes, and you call save changes, something may blow up when you're in the process of either creating the commands to send to the database or maybe even something in the database. And if you've got 10 or 100 entities that you're calling save changes on in one call, it's not obvious which thing had a problem. So I just want to make sure you're aware of the fact that if you look inside of the update exception, there's a property in there called state entries. And if you drill down into the state entries, you can actually find the entity that created the problem, and then you can go from there. This is really great for debugging, but it's also possibly something you might want to use in your applications if you're doing granular exception handling. For example, if you have concurrency exceptions, now a lot of times with concurrency exceptions, people just do a refresh all, just update everything. Client wins, I don't care. Or oh, something happened on the server, bring everything from the server back. I don't care what the person doing the data entry just did, just overwrite it all. So those are really the general options, but it is possible to stop and do some more granular exception handling with this kind of information, so you can really drill in and get the entity. So it's just a little tip I wanted to get in while I had the opportunity. The last tip that I wanted to talk about is actually a really important one, and it's a double whammy. The first part is something I hope most of you working with Entity Framework or LINQ in any way, especially LINQ to SQL, are familiar with, which is the fact that you can pre-compile LINQ queries. Okay, and the compilation of a LINQ query is when you take the LINQ query and figure out what the actual store query is. So you go from the LINQ query to the actual query that's going to go to the database. It's a lot of work, and it's a big part of the process of compiling and executing the LINQ queries. And Entity SQL also does a bunch of that work. But with the LINQ queries, you can actually pre-compile them, and rather than have to do this process every single time, if you have a query perhaps you're using frequently and just maybe changing the parameter, right? Just go get a customer, go get another customer, go get another customer, or go get the orders for this customer, go get the orders for that customer, right? It's the same query just with a different parameter, and you're doing that same work over and over and over again. So it's possible to pre-compile them, and then you can invoke the query, not invoke the query, but invoke the function that is the result of a precompiled query. You can invoke that precompiled query and leverage the already figured out store query. You don't have to do that work again. So that's a really important thing to be aware of. You'll see some code about how to do that, but that's not actually the tip, because that's common. You may not know it, but it is information that's out there. People have blogged about it and written about it. But what's not so well known is that the precompiled queries, if you don't use them properly when you're on a website, you're not going to get any advantage of them. The reason is because the function that you get out of a precompiled query is tied to the object context when you're working, well, wherever you're working, whatever kind of application you're using. So if the object context is short-lived, as in a web application, a web service, a website, and every time you post back, that object context is created anew, then each time that precompiled query is going to get recompiled again. So you're not using it over and over and over again. Instead, you're compiling it over and over and over again. And I've seen blog posts where people have said, well, I did performance tests on this, and I used precompiled queries, and I saw no difference at all. It was taking just as long. And the reason is because they were pre-compiling the query repeatedly, rather than using the precompiled query over and over again. So I just want to show you a pattern for doing this. And again, once you see it, it may look really obvious to you, and it seems so to me, but I had never seen it before, and I only just thought of this like at the end of last year. I was like, of course, this is the way to solve the problem. So I'll show you an application that takes advantage of that. So this is just bless you. Where'd everything go? Did I close my Solution Explorer? There we go. Okay, so I have a simple web application that uses object data sources to populate different controls in there. The object data sources are dependent on some business classes that I've created. I call them provider classes, object providers. So they're dependent on some object providers to give them data and do updates and things like that. So I'm going to open up one of these object providers. What I'm doing here is, I've created a variable, a function, for what will be my precompiled query. And I'm making it a static function. This particular code is in Visual Basic, so in Visual Basic, this is called shared, not static. But I'm making it a shared function, which means even as this class is instantiated and then disposed and reinstantiated. So it'll keep going away, but because this is shared or static, this function, this instance will stay alive for the lifetime of the application process, right? In a web application, that means not just one user, but everybody who's using it. So everybody who's using this web application will get the advantage of this precompiled query over and over and again. And over and over. I realize I'm saying that over and over again. So we get that advantage not just across users and across postbacks, but across sessions as well. So that, think about, 200 times that you don't have to recompile that, or 1,000 or 8,000 times you don't have to recompile that. So that's shared across the application process. What I do is when I instantiate the business class, I check to see if that's been compiled or not. If it's been compiled, then this variable will have something in it, but it hasn't been compiled yet, then I need to go ahead and compile it. So I'm going to go ahead and run this, and you can see, you'll be able to see that it doesn't the first time I'm accessing or instantiating this customer provider, it sees that the function doesn't exist yet, so it's going to go ahead and compile it. And I'm just going to run ahead now. And now we've come to the next method, which is the website has the object data source that said, okay, I need some customer data. So it can invoke that query that already exists. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and run this some more. Now I've come to my order provider because I have orders. So it's compiling that query, the query for the order for the first time. And then my detail providers, that's compiling for the first time also. Now I come to the page. Now you'll notice you may have noticed, I have a breakpoint every time I'm recompiling that query. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and select another order, and I didn't hit the breakpoint. And I'm going to select another order, and I didn't hit the breakpoint. So what I'm doing is all of these times now, as I move around and if I go to another customer, etc., I'm not having to go through the expense of figuring out what the store query is to go and get all the order details or to go and get all the orders. And it's a huge, huge benefit because the cost of compiling that query is a very, very big cost in the whole process of working with Entity Framework and executing your queries. So that's the solution to that. And so I'm gonna wrap this up. So we should have about 10 minutes for Q&As. But I just wanted to remind remind you that some of the things I talked about are the problems that we had to find workarounds for have gone away. These problems have gone away with Entity Framework 4. So the foreign keys, you can still build a model that doesn't surface the foreign keys. So you can still build a model the way we're building them today. And also, this will be backwards compatible. So if you have an existing model, it won't automatically try to use foreign keys. It'll go, oh, it's just one of, the model, the relationship type model rather than the foreign key model. So it'll know, Entity Framework will know how to deal with that. Another thing that you saw me use a lot in this presentation was Entity SQL. I think a lot of people overlook Entity SQL. And LINQ to Entities is definitely my first choice for querying, and I try to use that the most. But there's a lot of times when I can solve problems with Entity SQL that I can't solve with LINQ to Entities. And the other thing you saw me do is really dig further into the APIs. For example, you saw me use the metadata workspace. There's a lot of stuff inside of the Entity Framework APIs that you can take advantage of. So there's my contact information again, but I'm going to probably take the control back. Actually, I'm just trying to see if there's a way I can look at the, I can. I can look at the chat window and leave this window open. So,
oh, great.
So that's it. Thanks, Catherine, and thanks for manning the chat window for me.
Hey, Julie, that was great. I thought you covered a lot of great tips and tricks, although I was hoping that you would show us how to build an enterprise application.
Well, I would need another 5 minutes to build an enterprise application on the fly for you. So if we can go a little longer, I'm happy to.
No,
just
that's
kidding.
Fine. So there have been a lot of good questions, but everyone has jumped in and answered them. So if I just want to tell the attendees, if you have any questions. Okay, here's one from Carl.
There's the advantage of having people like Dishan on the line and Matthew Maziel, who are pretty familiar with Entity Framework.
Yes. So here's one from Carl concerning foreign keys. Is it going to be either or is the foreign key going to be scalar value and we'll still have the navigation properties? He asked that back at the beginning when you were talking about foreign keys.
Yeah, and I didn't get into that. But, yes, we absolutely still have the relationship and all the navigation properties. You actually have both. And it's not the only way you would have either or is if you remove you can remove the associations between the entities and then just have the foreign keys. But, in fact, you can do that with entities today. If you just take the associations away, the navigation properties go away, but then you can have the entity key surface right as one of the scalar values.
Great. And Anthony's asking, is there an ETA for the rough cuts of the next version of your book?
Well, I better go now. Get back to work. I think what we're hoping to do is have them first be available around the time of TDC. So that will give me a chance to, get pretty far along, and also have had a chance to get some feedback from some tech reviewers, so that it'll be rough, but it won't be really rough.
Okay.
So we're hoping, and TDC is in November.
And will it be a rough cut?
Pardon me?
Will it be a rough cut?
Yes.
Okay, good.
That's the plan. The plan is to do rough cuts, but we're not going to push them out immediately. I mean, I've already started doing a few chapters. I've already got a bunch of chapters under my belt, but we're not going to push them out yet.
Okay, that's great.
And also, another reason for that is that it's really important for me to be working against Beta 2, not Beta 1, before I share some of this stuff, because I've got some, fill in the blanks to complete and things to verify when Beta 2 comes out.
Right, and it's a huge book, so I don't envy you at all. But here's Luciano asking, what do you think of the model first feature coming in VS 2010/.NET 4?
Model first is a very cool way to go, and I think it's really funny how so many developers like me were often approaching these things with existing databases. So I want to write an application using data, enterprise data that already exists. But so often people are starting from scratch. People do write new applications and do have new businesses and new domains. So it makes a lot of sense to be able to start with a model and generate the database from there. You know, it's going to take a lot of, it's not for everybody. If you're in the kind of enterprise that you've got lots of DBAs, they are not going to be horribly keen on the idea of, you know, an automatically generated database. However, there's a lot that you can do to customize how the generation happens, and you can also just use that as a kind of a first stab at getting the database out, and then let a DBA continue to work with that, and then you can then go the other direction and update the model from the existing database. So it's an iterative process.
Okay. All right. And Don is asking if Entity Framework plays well with SharePoint 2010? Yeah, 2010.
I have absolutely no idea.
Oh, okay. And then here's another one. I'm not sure. Let me see. It's from Robbie, and he says, is there a way to do custom mapping of, say, a small lint to a .NET INT32 or to a system.boolean? So you probably can't see that question. What?
Yeah, no, I understand. I understand. One thing I know with Entity Framework 4, some of that stuff has been relaxed a lot, and I haven't really pushed the envelope on it too much in terms of the schema validation being really, really meticulous about those types. I think there's going to be some more leniency in there. How to achieve that in the first version of Entity Framework? My first answer is I don't know, but the reason I don't know is because I believe that I've seen this question a number of times in the forums, and I believe that the response from the team has always been, it's just, you know, you can't do it. But I'm always afraid to say you can't ever do something. There's always, sometimes, always, you like to think there's always a way. So I'm just not confident on answering that. I'm pretty sure in any framework version 1 there's just no way to do it, and I think in the next version things might get a little easier, so it might not be such a big worry, because those are small jumps to make from, you know, from a small int to a Boolean. You know, different than from a char to an int or something like that. Just trying to think. The previous question, can you tell me again what the previous question was? There was something else I wanted to say about that.
The SharePoint 2010 or a different
yeah.
one?
I'm trying to remember. I believe that early on in Entity Framework, even before it was released, I remember somebody from the team had actually done some interaction with SharePoint. I mean, SharePoint all stores in SQL Server databases anyway. So he had done some kind of interaction. I don't remember what it was. And the other piece that I just wanted to mention is Entity Framework and Entity Data Models are like really big in many all over Microsoft. People from many different teams are learning how to use it and incorporating it into their products. So I would imagine SharePoint's a big target for Entity Framework. But, you know, for the specifics of what versions work with what versions, that I really just don't know.
Okay. And Richard was asking if we have an existing LINQ to SQL app, is it useful to migrate to Entity Framework?
I would do that only if you have a need to do that. If you want to take the application further, if you want to take it in directions that LINQ to SQL just isn't going to satisfy for you. But if you've got an existing LINQ to SQL application solution and it's doing everything you need, I have a couple of them out there in production, and I'm just leaving them be. They're doing their job. You know, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But if you do plan, you know, that your application is going to grow, or you're going to start, you know, hitting other databases, or you want to start taking advantage of some of the bigger capabilities that are available in Entity Framework, then that's a different story.
Okay.
I hope that satisfies your question, Richard. anybody also, feel free to, ask me on Twitter or send me emails to follow up with some of these questions. I'd be more than happy to follow up on them.
Okay, and Julie, did you say that you would have this code available on your site for download? A lot of people have that.
I'll take this solution, and I will zip it up along with a script for the database that I'm using. It's just a little database that I created. And I will put them on the downloads page of the LearnEntityFramework.com site. That's the site for the book.
Okay. That's Learn Entity
I might not
Framework.
do it in the next 5 minutes, but I will do it.
.com.
In the very near future, the next couple of days.
Good to know. Okay, so in a couple days. And then, Bill, I know we're about out of time, but Bill is asking if Entity Framework 4 is available to test, or is it a closed beta?
Oh, absolutely. Visual Studio 2010 is out in Beta 1 right now. And Entity Framework is part of Visual Studio, so it's not a separate product. The people always are asking, when does Visual Studio 2010 come out, and when does Entity Framework come out? But they're one and the same, so it's part of that. So Visual Studio 2010, if you go to, I'll write it down right in the little chat window here, msdn.microsoft.com vStudio. Right at the top of the page, there's a link that says, get the Visual Studio 2010 beta. So it's VS 2010 plus .NET 4, and the Entity Framework 4 Beta 1 is in there. Don't miss out on the Entity Framework feature CTP. That's also, it's a bunch of a couple of really important features of Entity Framework that they weren't able to get into Entity Framework 4. So they're going to supply it out of band and support it out of band, and it's called the Entity. Oh, I didn't hit enter. I didn't hit.
No, I was going to ask you. So
I could do it again. msdn.microsoft.com vStudio. That's the Visual Studio Developer Center.
There we go.
And then the feature CTP has in it two really important features. One is it's self-tracking entities, which is it's actually, they provide a T4 template that will create the entity classes in a different way. It'll generate a different flavor of entity classes that are able to track the entity state. And so you have a lot of, it's a huge advantage when you're using Entity Framework across processes, in web services, and in websites. So that's one of them. And the other is something called code-only design, where you can actually eliminate the need to build the model. The model is absolutely necessary for Entity Framework APIs to do their job, but code only will look at the classes and it will build the metadata on the fly at runtime so the Entity Framework can do the rest of its job. So check out the feature CTP. You can get at that through the ADO.NET team blog, which I think I typed before, but blogs.msdn.com ADO.NET. That's the team blog. I also want to say thank you so much to the other people on the chat room who've been answering questions. That is so awesome. I'm kind of scrolling through here and seeing.
Yeah, it's really great.
What's been going on there. It's a community. Thank you very much. And there's a lot of people in there. I can get a copy of this, right?
Yes, you can. Actually, I always keep a copy of it, and if you I'll email it to you afterwards, and anyone else can ask me for it too. Just send email to webcast@o'Reilly.com. You can copy it yourself, by the way, just by clicking in the window, select all and copy and then paste in a text file. But if you don't do that, you can grab it from me. I'd be happy to send it to you.
Okay. I'm also answering a couple little questions in the chat window too.
Great. And I just want to thank you, Julie, and thank everyone else who joined us today. It was a great, really interesting, great webcast. So I hope we can have you back.
And
maybe after.
And that's coming from somebody who's not even a programmer. So thanks, Catherine. And thanks, everybody, for attending. It's always fun for me to talk about Entity Framework and have people who are willing to listen.
Okay. All right. So, folks, I've been told before I close out too quickly and people can't grab the chat room. But if you want to, you should do it right now because I'm going to close out the window in just a minute. And I hope you'll all join us again for another webcast. All right? Bye-bye.